Hello, in this episode of Ask Me Anything, we talk to Richard Pierce, an influential figure in the world of sustainable finance, who spent most of his professional career working for Microsoft and is a founder of Responsible Risk, an innovative consultancy helping to put sustainable finance to practice. Hello, Richard. Great to have you here.
Hello, lovely to see you. Thanks for having me.
So I would like us to start from the basics, which are not really basic, but quite complex when it comes to sustainability, especially in the context of finances. And we thought you can perhaps simplify it for us by giving us your definition of what sustainability is.
Yes, well, I mean, my definition, I hope, is the dictionary definition, which is, really it's about the avoidance of depletion of resources, and if you are going to deplete them, then to restore and come back to a balance, and that balance fundamentally is with nature in mind, an ecological balance, which gives us a balance for humanity to thrive and survive.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
It should be quite simple, I think, really. Of course, there are many motions and processes within that, but at its baseline, I think it is, take out, less than the planet can actually, deliver to us, and find balance and restore that and rewild when you actually have taken things out of balance.
Yeah, thank you. The idea of economic growth seems to be at odds with the concept of, say, sustainability. I guess this is some kind of a traditional, perhaps outdated notion, and you probably don't agree. So, but how does sustainable finance address this issue?
Well, I think it is, it depends what level of reduction you go to. I mean, it is an exceedingly complex area. And I think, you really have to look at economists and climate scientists and biological environmental scientists for a total answer. But I think a good place to look at for your audience is that in the UK, Her Majesty's Treasury recently worked with Professor Dasgupta, and Dasgupta has written something called the Dasgupta Review, which is over 600 pages. In that, what he's trying to do is not value nature and put a price on nature, but he's trying to look at the economics of nature and how sustainability fits within that framework, and how we look at GDP differently and so forth. And I think, in a way, to answer that question of economic growth and sustainability, which is complex and nuanced, a very good place to start would be there. But I suppose if you press me, I would say, the biggest issue that he talks about is that externalities, which basically means the things that we use from nature that we don't put a price on or that we don't value in the economic system. And so therefore, we are taking things away from the planet whilst we are delivering economic growth. They talk about this being the best of times in many respects, in terms of reduction in poverty and growth. I mean, it depends on your point of view. But on the other hand, it's the worst of times in terms of the excessive consumption that we're making from planetary resources and climate change. So count the externalities that haven't been priced before. The water, the air, the forest, and so forth. Bring those into the equation, put a proper price on them, and then we'll be able to understand really what is meant by economic growth with that point of balance with nature in mind.
Yeah, very interesting. So it feels like it's more realistic than it was actually before, that we take, in fact, environment into account.
Yeah, we've got to talk about, we're talking about net gain on biodiversity. So, if we take anything away, then we don't just restore it, we actually give back more than we took away. We've got to, deal with the usual reduce, reuse, and recycle. And all of these things, many of them have been known for a long time, but and I don't think, there is a nirvana and a silver bullet. But if we can, as I think is happening, if we can orchestrate the world's finances, and as we know, money makes the world go round, and if the measurement and the measure and the management of the way that money is allocated, capital is allocated, takes into account these externalities, we'll certainly have a better understanding of the effect that we're having in the world, and hopefully we'll be able to get ourselves to some sort of growth without such negative impacts. But there are many pages written on this, but I certainly recommend the Dasgupta review to you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So let's talk about your company called Responsible Risk, or maybe I should call it initiative rather than company. You will tell us in a second.
It's a company and an initiative, I hope, but yeah.
Yeah, so it looks like both at the same time. So if you could tell us a little bit more about it and how was it conceived?
Yeah, so as you said, I was at Microsoft for 23 years, and in a way, I think of myself as being a sort of jack of all trades and master of none. I ran marketing, I was in consulting, I was in evangelism, just the whole range. But the beauty of that was seeing many industries, many disciplines. But I ended up in about the last 10 years in the financial services sector, and in particular working on open banking, APIs, fintech specifically as the global lead for that for Microsoft. And in that, I came across sustainable finance, realized that one of the biggest issues, as highlighted by Michael Bloomberg in the Financial Stability Board launch with Mark Carney and the Task Force for Carbon-Related Financial Disclosure, was that the issue was this measurement and this management that we've been talking about, and the absence of data. Now, clearly, in my role in a sort of worldwide strategy firm for a big tech company, that therefore was something I wanted to create a strategy for us to embrace, because we clearly think we had good answers around data. Certainly using things like the Internet of Things and sensors and planetary computing as a way of actually bringing data to the financial services industry. So I explored with like-minded colleagues. We did some big engagements with a couple of very large financial services industries, and we established that this was, a good area for us to work on. And I really wanted to do it 100% of my time, because I think once you get, the passion of conservation combined with your day job of financial services and technology, that's what you want. That's all you want to do. So I wasn't able to do that, so I left and set up Responsible Risk. But one of the key things I had seen was that over the previous 10 years or so, we had been trying to obviously explain the role of cloud computing. And bear with me for a second, I think there's a parallel here. We've been going to the world and saying, you've got computers in your offices, we'd like you to put your technology, your data into computers in our offices, if you will, in the cloud. It's actually not that complex an idea or process, but it took billions of dollars, consulting, papers, advertising, salespeople, consultants to make that happen. And to a certain extent, for me, the biggest tipping points were when we would find, as I worked very closely with a company called ClearBank, which is based out of London, first new clearing bank in 250 years. They built their platform on the cloud, and it was obviously a very seriously regulated entity. And at that point, everybody went, aha, I see how it can be done. And then people started to really copy. Now, it wasn't just that one moment, but people need to see examples and they need to be able to copy. And so with Responsible Risk, I thought, how do we create that situation for climate, biodiversity and sustainable finance? I haven't got billions of dollars, and I'm never going to, with the best will of the world. So I want to use an ecosystem, I want to use a network of all the people I've met through my career, and I want us to build examples. If at the beginning they have to be, fictitious scenarios that subsequently become proof of concept, that subsequently become very large established companies, That is the way I will address it, whilst others are focusing on policy, regulation, law, etc. I can't influence that. That's going to happen. It's going to take years. I'll focus on creating case studies. So responsible risk was set up to do that. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do is storytelling. Who are the best cases and examples out there? Matchmaking, bringing people together, multidisciplinary, and then coaching, trying to get the best ideas to be successful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we would like to ask you about the goals that you have in responsible risk. So as I understand, like your main goal is actually to educate the decision makers in the financial industry how to actually apply this idea and how in practice they can actually change their business to somehow follow this idea of sustainability. Is this correct?
Yeah, and I want to go further than perhaps the sort of the education in the sense of just telling you what to do. We would really want to learn by doing together. Yeah. Because I don't have all the answers, and nobody does. But we know that it takes a village, it takes a town, it takes a community to actually roll up their sleeves, multidisciplinary group to actually solve such complex problems. So as a sort of unencumbered entity, as a small organization without a particular financial goal in mind, or a specific I need to hire these people and deliver this project by this time, which would give me bias. I have to feed that army. What I wanted to do was to build this network. So think of it like the Hollywood model, if you've heard of that, where the director says, right, we're going to create the movie, and then along comes the lighting people and the makeup people, and everybody comes together. They're all freelancers, but they all know what the mission is, and they all put together the project. In a way, I'm operating like that, and the movie that we're trying to produce is the movie which says this is how we can solve for sustainable finance, the data need for it specifically, so that capital can be allocated to projects downstream, many and various, that will actually obviously make the impact to climate and to carbon and to biodiversity. But it's the data and the financial services industry specifically. So that's where I'm focused. But when I say making the movie, it's actually, we get together, we look at the biggest problems and opportunities, and then we say, right, let's figure out in a public environment how we can discuss these things, how we can get the best inputs from the audience, how we can capture the resolutions and the ideas, and then how we can make that available to people so that they can say, oh, okay, I want to make a business in that, or I want to refine that and make that better. So it's not just telling you, it's working with you to try and find new patterns and practices.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if it has already happened that you are maybe working on some specific cases of doing business, creating a business which is sustainable at heart.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things from our very last workshop, we had focused initially on climate related issues, but we realized, particularly with COP15 coming up, that we should focus on biodiversity and natural capital. So in May, we did a workshop, and what we tend to do is we try and look at it from the investor lens. What's the challenge and opportunity for the investor, but also the investee? What's the challenge and opportunity? And quite often there's a big disconnect. People say, I've got a need and an idea, and the investors are saying, I've got money, but they can't meet, and it can't turn into a project. And we were looking at that and saying, well, what is that in the world of natural capital? And the investors were saying, well, it's because we need to take 3, 4, 5 years to pull together all of the stakeholders to create projects big enough for us to invest in, to make a really big impact. And a lot of the conservationists were saying, well, I've got lots of small projects. They're not 20 billion. All I want is 2 million or 5 million. Well, that's a disconnect, unfortunately. So to answer your question directly, we tried to find an alternative, and we looked at the case of rewilding, and particularly in the UK, where the government is changing agricultural incentives. So instead of saying, just keep growing things or just leaving farming land fallow, what we want you to do is to bring that back to its wild state and reintroduce, the species and the natural environment, meanders of rivers, as opposed to canalized rivers, etc. But the problem is the subsidies aren't quite sufficient to give the farmer the incentive to do this. So we found a conservationist, a rewilding specialist that was deeply knowledgeable and engaging in the field. And then we found a tokenization expert in Switzerland who was very focused on low carbon blockchain solutions, whereby we could think of a model of looking at the rents and leases and trophic, taking photographs of animals or sponsoring an animal, all of the different revenue streams that could come, finding a way of evidencing them, tokenizing them, and then actually making that token available as an investable asset. So both giving revenue as well as also being an investable asset. Now, this was only at the beginning of May, but we are exploring this whole concept now. So this went from just an idea to a workshop to people now trying to establish that. But in other areas, we've had other companies who've said, right, I'm going to go from just being a consulting firm, I'm going to build a product so that I can build a really high quality ESG system so that I can ingest data, normalize it, and evidence it to financiers so that they can feel high degree of confidence in the data that's coming their way. So hopefully we're genuinely moving from talk to activity.
Thanks for this example. The idea that you can connect the problem of biodiversity and blockchains seems like science fiction. It's quite amazing. So are there any initiatives or projects that you're involved right now beside responsible risk?
Yes, well, obviously, with Finextra, where I do the storytelling, and they kindly give me the opportunity to be the contributing editor there. That is one aspect of work, and normally I'm on the other side of the interview to you guys. But on sustainablefinance.live, which is the workshop series I've just spoken about. But then I'm very excited to work with people like Earth Knowledge. So Earth Knowledge is a company of climate scientists, earth scientists, who for 20 years have been sort of shouting and saying, we have got the data that will help you make good decisions on, urbanization and rewilding and environment and so forth. So even when I was at Microsoft, I was helping them get that data and put it into the cloud so that it was much more accessible and they could do more modeling with it. And now they're bringing that to the financial services community with 200 plus indicators, which allow you to put in a geospatial area, understand where your assets sit within that, and then the risks associated with it from a whole Earth systems analysis, not just water, not just flood, not just fire, but the whole temporal and spatial timeline associated with that asset. So that's interesting, but again, I don't want to be pushing one company. We have others in the advisory board who I don't know so well, but I'm really happy to push. Savest, which is a British company that's been part of our advisory board, and then Oxio, which is coming out of Oxford University. Everybody's welcome if what they're doing is trying to really produce good quality data to help us in this crisis.
Yeah, it is really, really interesting and insightful. And I also think it's also like it's happening right now. It's impossible to ignore how important it is for us to ensure that we are sustainable in our everyday life, but also in fintech. And there are more and more fintech companies that claim to be green at heart, but there are also businesses that exploit this idea. So how does one differentiate a true sustainable practice from a greenwashing? What's your stand on this? How do you feel?
Well, you know, it is difficult, and it's very easy for people to sort of throw rocks at it and say, well, you know, Tesla, the consumer thinks it's green because they're driving electric, but you know, they're using rubber in their tires, and the rubbers come from Indonesia, and you know, the rubber is deforested. You know, it's a very complex thing, and I don't think that, you know, anybody other than the most committed sort of environmentalists is going to go through the whole supply chain analysis to understand, you know, who's behind a particular product and its claims. But that is why what we're doing is we're seeing from particularly the European Union focus on things like the SFDR. And the SFDR is obviously targeted at the financial services industry, and it's saying you've got to classify your as an asset manager, you know, your portfolio, your funds, etc., and you've got to tell us how green it is. And people talk about sort of 50 shades of green, because you know that is the kind of spectrum. But I'll read from the quotes. So the SFDR requires specific firm level disclosures from asset managers and investment advisors regarding how they address key considerations. And then they talk about Article 6, Article 8, and Article 9. And these define, you know, are you, is ESG integrated? Are you promoting a social environmental characteristic, but it may not be your core objective, or is it really its key objective? So they're starting to, you know, weigh and look at the portfolios in this way. Over the next 3 years, that'll become clearer. This will link to labeling, and I think, you know, you'll end up a bit like you know, organic food or whatever, where the label should become clear to the consumer. The underlying construct is clear to the provider of the product with the label. And then obviously the body that can interrogate and prosecute, because there is manipulation, if you will, is able to do so because there is clear definition and regulation and law that can be followed up to prosecute if the notion is abused.
Mm-hmm. Okay. From your perspective as an advisor, what are the essential steps for a financial company that would like to start implementing a sustainable policy?
Well, I think if you look at TCFD, which is you know, this task force on climate-related financial disclosure, this is a very clear route to go, and this talks to the executive of the financial firm, and it says, you know, you've got to allocate certain roles, you've got to do certain things, and it's very much at a management level of putting your right people in place. What tends to follow, I think, is people go, well, what do I do next? I mean, that was relatively easy. And I was very touched by Daniel Clear when he was the head of sustainability at HSBC, and he spoke at a conference about the steps they'd run at HSBC. So they said the Bank of England is going to run stress tests, and which they've now started. The purpose of the stress test is to maintain financial stability. So your book of loans, the equities that you hold, etc., represents the value of the company. And the HSBC obviously is an organization where its stability is crucial to overall global stability. And this is the same for that class. So we need to know, do you understand which assets you've got which are at risk of climate change? Do you know how to measure? Do you know how to manage that? And you need to report that to us. So that is the genesis of really why the Financial Stability Board and the TCFD have put this pressure onto the financial services industry. He then went on to say what they did was they ran a pilot to make sure they were ready for the stress tests. So they did 3 steps. They defined the scenarios from the Bank of England and the Network of Greening the Financial System, the NGFS. And those bodies will actually give you a lot of data. If you don't have data, they'll give you a lot. And so they ran the stress tests. Then they checked on their exposure. So they looked at 10 portfolios, 6 industrial areas, 4 real estate, residential, commercial, They applied physical stress tests, transition stress tests. And then finally, they looked at their management and they said, are you, do you have the data? How will you respond? What will you do with our products? How will you engage our customers? So I think that the playbook is starting to become clear for any financial services organization. And I think they're already in the mature economies starting to exercise the scenario and the training muscle. The next question is, how do we unwind ourselves from perhaps long holdings that we have, and that's why I think you sometimes hear some sort of prevarication, because people are trying to obviously look after their shareholders as well as their stakeholders and protect their revenues and their share prices. So that's why I think they know, but then they have to sort of gently unwind positions without everybody doing a fire sale.
Yeah.
Thanks for this. So before we finish, we actually would like to ask you for some inspiring use case to illustrate some innovation that is done or is being done in the spirit of sustainability.
Well, as I said right at the beginning, I think I've got to find good use cases, good evidence that this is achievable. And one of the real inspirations for me is a bank called Triodos. Triodos obviously is initially a Dutch bank. There's an association of banks with good values that are now associated, many of them coming from Holland. And Triodos now have a bank in the UK, and Bevis Watts, who's the CEO, is somebody that inspires me all the time. We did an interview recently, and he spoke about natural capital, and what they're actually doing is going into trying to rewild the wetlands in I think it was the northeast coast of England. And so literally a bank going out there trying to initiate projects so that as a flood protection, if you get the water into the marshland is obviously soaking up that water. That stops the downstream flooding of cities and properties. But you need to bring together, citizens, insurance companies, farmers, and bring all of that together, and then find the revenue streams from it that are investable, so that you can build a bankable asset. But ultimately, you might not just be taking cash, you might be taking carbon credits, and who knows, in the future, biodiversity credits. And as a bank, I find that really inspiring that they can lead that, working hand in hand with NGOs. And I think that's a great example. But then they're not alone. Mirova, the asset manager, basically went into this area trying to build a fund some 5 years ago, and have subsequently gone on to do blue ocean funds and forestry, as well as others, pioneering the way, trying to find the way to find the projects to invest in. And then people like Tribe Capital. Tribe Capital are a small impact investor who are really, tooth and nail pursuing the purity of investing in solutions. So I think, the actual projects, you can see wonderful examples. WWF produced a great book called The Blueprint for Bankable Nature Solutions. Mm-hmm. And there are dozens of great inspirational solutions. But the key thing is behind it, there's a diagram, a bit like you've got behind you, Lucas, which says this is where the money came from. This was the special purpose vehicle. This is where the income came from. This is how we got the money to fund these projects. So if anybody wants a blueprint, that's a great place to look.
Great. Thanks, Richard. It was a great pleasure to talk to you. It was not only insightful, but for us, we actually had an occasion to learn a lot about the sustainable aspect of finance. So, and I hope for all of our audience, it will be very valuable. So thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me, and I look forward to learning from all of your great listeners and audience some more new stories I can tell.